going to have 12 secrets I'm going to go through. This is based on a very popular article which ran in Untapped New York. Just to give you a little bit of background on Untapped New York. Untapped New York was started 13 years ago by a very good friend of mine, Michelle Young, who is a professor at Columbia University, was a trained architect and part of the graduate school for design and urban planning. And she wanted to get more into what makes New York tick, especially a lot of the secrets and hidden gems of New York. So she started Untapped New York. I came on later in 2015 to start Untapped New York's experiences department. And so we started out giving tours of New York with Untapped New York banner. It was actually Untapped Cities back then. And then a couple of years ago, we started an insider subscription program, which Rich who is here today, is part of. And we're really happy we were able to take New Yorkers in person to some of these great behind the scenes places. And what ended up happening with the pandemic last year is we took all of it virtual, insiders and tours. And we have, with the New York Insiders, have been growing quite a great global group ourselves. And we are happy to say that we are back to now a hybrid of virtual and insider in-person programming again. So it's a whole new world. But I am going to get started. I see people are coming in. I think Anastasia is going to be able to get them in, but if not, I may take a brief pause to let more people into the room. So let's go. And let's start. So my secret number one, the Brooklyn Bridge had active wine vaults. So this is all of these are, I'm going to say all of these are my favorite, but this is really one of my favorites because the Brooklyn Bridge is really one of my favorite structures in New York, not only an icon, but an absolute force to be reckoned with. When it was built, it took 14 years to build this structure, and it is still, there's nothing like it in the world, so says I. But in the anchorages, they actually were renting out space right after the bridge opened in 1883 to store champagne and wine. And before we even get into that, let me explain a little bit about what the Brooklyn Bridge anchorage is, or just an anchorage in a bridge in general. For the Brooklyn Bridge, they had 4 suspender cables that make it a suspension bridge. And they had to arduously basically thread over the East River from Brooklyn to Manhattan multiple times 1-inch strands of steel wire. And this was a process that went on for 7 years. And you'll see here, there are these sort of steel eye bars where they would run these large strands through. They would sink these guys down, and then they would cover them over in cement and then masonry. And they're 90,000 ton masonry anchorages on each side, the Brooklyn and the Manhattan side of the Brooklyn Bridge. And this is a shot of the Manhattan anchorages. And you can see, for those of you who live in New York, I'm sure you've been down to this area. It's on Frankfort Street. For those of you who have never visited, this is actually quite a treat, because I'll show you what it looks like today. But back then, you can see each of these anchorages had portals for retail. The Roebling family that designed the Brooklyn Bridge wanted the anchorages to serve as retail spaces, and that never happened. You might also notice where my cursor is all the way on the far left is actually a train shed, because streetcars and trolleys ran over the Brooklyn Bridge and would basically terminate on Brooklyn, because trolleys never ran in Manhattan. Streetcars did, but trolleys were only a Brooklyn thing, when Brooklyn was its own city up until 1889. This is what those portals look like today. As a matter of fact, this picture is even dated. It was taken last year, but they have actually opened up all of these portals as they are doing massive renovations inside the anchorages right now. And as you can see so a couple of years ago, we were able to sneak in. This is totally not legal, by the way, because it is run by New York's Department of Transportation, and they absolutely do not want anybody in there. But if you go into the west side of the Manhattan anchorage and find this passageway, if you go down the hall, you will come to this room. And this room used to be a place where anybody who was storing champagne from the late 1880s into the early 1900s would get access to their own private collections. And you can even see there's a fresco right on top of the portal that still has the word champagne over it. And then a company that was producing champagne, which I believe no longer is, but I'm not sure about that. And this was called the Blue Grotto. And it was called the Blue Grotto because of this space right on the right side of my screen, where they had a statue of the Virgin Mary, which was placed there to bless the booze. And there was even an inscription right over her that said, "He who not loveth wine, women, and song remaineth a fool his whole life long." And that was sort of greeting the people as they came in. And of course, the statue of Mary was there to bless the booze, to make sure that the booze aged well and did not spoil. Why did they use these vaults as wine cellars? Two reasons, one of which is the Brooklyn Bridge Company needed to recoup its losses. Because they had spent so much money over budget on building the bridge. And actually, because they were a party to fraud, which is a very long story, both the cities of Brooklyn and New York, because they were separate at the time, actually had to come and take co-ownership of the Brooklyn Bridge. And they needed to find any way they could to make money to recoup all of the losses that it took. It cost about $15 million to build this bridge back in the 1880s, which was a lot of money. Now, also embedded not too far away from this vault are unused subway tracks, because in the 19-teens, the second private subway company that New York had, which is known as the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit Company, or the BMT. And for those New Yorkers on the talk today, the BMT, or those who know New York subways very well, the BMT are the J, the Z, the N, the Q, the R, and the W, so the yellow and the brown lines. They were supposed to go over the Brooklyn Bridge, and these were the portals to give the trains access to the bridge span itself. Here's a closer look, and you can even see there are sort of the ghosts of train tracks in there leading up to the bridge. There they are, that have never been used. Again, for those of you who know, Chambers Street under the Manhattan Municipal Building on the JZ was actually supposed to be called Brooklyn Bridge, because you were supposed to be able to get a subway train to Brooklyn from there, but over the bridge. It wouldn't come until 1930, and then they took you all the way down to the Montague Tunnel. Now, leaving the Brooklyn Bridge, let's go to another iconic structure in New York. Secret number 2, there is a tennis court in Grand Central Terminal. We at Untapped New York do public tours of Grand Central Terminal. Before the pandemic, we were doing them 6 days a week. We took Mondays off. We are now back up to about 5 tours a week, and they're filling up, so that's good. That means we're getting back into the swing of things. And one of the favorite hits of this tour is a space that so many people, even New Yorkers, even people who commute using Grand Central Terminal, don't know about this space. And it is it's a tennis court. Now, where is this tennis court? Well, it's upstairs, and not exactly where we are here, but Michelle, founder, and I were lucky enough to get a tour with a gentleman by the name of Danny Brucker, who worked for the MTA and was giving super behind-the-scenes tours where the public could not go. And these are from the 6th floor balconies in the 3 60-foot windows. Those covers floors 3 to 6. And, oh, I don't know why that keeps getting stuck. There we go. This is a 1939 cutaway of Grand Central Terminal. And as you can see, everybody sort of knows the iconic concourse, those 6 large windows letting in all of the light. Of course, the mural, and there's so many secrets and stories about Grand Central Terminal. We could do a whole 2-hour talk on that. But I want to focus on space H, which is right here. So as you can see on the south side of the terminal, which 42nd Street is on the other side of those windows, you've got space J, which you can walk under today. Space H, which was a large cavernous area, and space G above it was actually an art school and an art gallery for many, many years before it became the nerve center of train traffic control for all of the Metro North trains that now use Grand Central Terminal as their terminal. But space H from the 1930s into the 1960s was actually CBS News studios. For many, many years, we had a very iconic anchorman. For those of you who might not know our media history, especially our New York area media history, named Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite was famous around the world because of his coverage of the moonshot in 1969, the moon landing. And he was delivering most of the news from Studio 42 on the 4th floor of Grand Central Terminal. CBS Studios would actually use the antenna on top of the Chrysler building next door to basically broadcast all over the tri-state area. And this is, again, that space upstairs, 4th floor of Grand Central Terminal. This was Studio 44. There were 2 studios, 42 and 44. Now, what happens is, you see those cameras. These cameras by the early 1960s were getting so sensitive that they could pick up the vibrations from 5 stories below. So CBS had to move out of this studio because there was too much movement and vibration from all the trains coming in and out. So this space is abandoned for a couple of years. They have a couple ideas of what they want to try. It's a very large space. So what they do is they turn it into a ski jump for 2 years, which this always amuses me. You can see that these people, it's not snow or ice that they're on. They're actually on a system of wheels that come down this sort of, artificial slope that they built in the old CBS studios. And doesn't look incredibly fun. As you can see, these people are definitely staged and not worth it. But they said, maybe this is what we can do with it. And they turned it into a tennis court. And that's what it is today. It is the Vanderbilt Tennis Club. It is a public club. Anybody can join. It is very hard to get court time there. Those iconic Grand Central windows are actually looking out onto 42nd and Park Avenue South. But if you were to go right outside, this is sort of the front door of Grand Central Terminal that you would be looking up at. There's also behind the court on the other side, there is a half court, practice court with a ball machine, and there's also a gym. And I just sort of love that juxtaposition between, sort of the Grand Central Warren and Wetmore architecture and this, tennis club. Now, while we are at the Grand Central Terminal, adjacent to Grand Central, but connected into the network of tracks, secret number 3, track 61, the secret track to the Waldorf Astoria. Now, a lot of these secrets are surrounded by their own extensive myth and lore. And one of the things we like to do at Untapped New York is sort of debunk that lore and tell you what the truth is, because there was a lot of stuff going on about this track. A lot of it was true and a lot of it was false. But Grand Central Terminal has 64 tracks that lead into it. Originally, when Grand Central Terminal, the first iteration of the building was built in 1872 as a depot. It was Grand Central Depot. It only had 12 tracks. It was very small. And it was not well devised for the amount of commuters who wanted to use it. In 1886, they upgraded Grand Central Depot to Grand Central Station. Now, the difference between a station and a terminal, in case you don't know, is a station means it's a through. That trains do not terminate there, they keep going. The reason why Grand Central was a station in 1886 was because the railroad known as the Harlem Line actually continued horse-drawn service south to the financial district back then from 42nd Street, where Grand Central Terminal is today. But a horrible train accident in 1902 forces the New York Central Rail Company, which used to own Grand Central Terminal, to do something completely crazy, which is quadruple the amount of tracks that they had and layer them 2 layers on top of each other, 2 floors. So you've got upper level, which used to be long distance travel up until the 1990s, and then lower level, which was all commuter. Well, now today, if you go to Grand Central Terminal, you might know it's all commuter now. All the national train travel, unfortunately, moved over to Penn Station, which is not very nice, although it's getting better. But if you look over here, where my cursor is sort of circling around, there are tracks that spiral off the main Grand Central Terminal track. And those used to go under that power plant. And I think I have an arrow that leads to it. But For those of you who are familiar with the back end or the north end of Grand Central Terminal, you may recognize this to be Park Avenue, but of course you might not, because none of the buildings that exist today are there. This was an ingenious decking system where they basically built buildings over the train tracks that we know as Park Avenue today. Park Avenue is basically a man-made deck, much like our new Hudson Yards is. But there is the power plant where those tracks would spiral off of. And of course, you needed the tracks to provide that power plant with fuel, which was mainly coal. And that plant serviced Grand Central Terminal until 1930. And then it was demolished. And there you can see the trains coming under the power plant, delivering what they need to deliver. Again, passengers were not delivered there. This was mainly for fuel until 1930. Now, there was, again, a much longer story, but there was an original Waldorf and Astoria. There were two buildings down where the Empire State Building is today on 34th Street, run by rival cousins. And then eventually what happens is the Empire State Building owns that land, buys that land, demolishes them, and the hotel proprietor that combined the two moved the Waldorf Astoria to where that power plant was on Park Avenue. And he's got access to these train tracks. And of course, here is the iconic lobby. That clock is from the Columbia Exposition. Right now, the Waldorf Astoria is going through massive renovations. It is being turned into a private condo. The towers themselves are turning into private-owned condos, and then they're opening, once again, 350 hotel room units in a couple of years. But famously, and a little bit too famously, actually, for those people who know New York secrets, our president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during World War II, used that Track 61 to bring a car right under the Waldorf Astoria because FDR was stricken with polio and he couldn't walk without the aid of crutches or braces or other people helping him to walk. And he didn't want the general public to know that. And as a matter of fact, the press at the time respected that quite a bit, a little different from whatever goes on today with the press for sure. But he took a whole train car. It went off under the Waldorf Astoria. The car was brought off the train and brought up to, on a freight elevator, to the garage level. He had access to a passenger elevator that brought him right up to a suite in the Waldorf Astoria. Now, that is his famous limousine, the Pierce Arrow, which he would bring with him everywhere. And this is how he greeted most of the American public, especially during the war when he was going around and speaking, so that, again, he didn't have to get out of the car. Now, this is Track 61 currently that sort of spirals off under the Waldorf Astoria. It does not go to Grand Central. It never ended up there. People try to go down and they go, Justin, I'm looking for Track 61. Where does it come in at Grand Central? It does not. It terminates at the Waldorf Astoria. Other dignitaries have used the train track. As a matter of fact, one of the last to do so was Hillary Clinton during a fundraising campaign dinner. She came in, basically she had a train waiting for her right at Track 61 in case there was an emergency. But FDR really only used it once, perhaps twice. He didn't use it habitually like some of the stories say. This car remained from one of the train sets that used Track 61 right under the Waldorf Astoria. And this picture was actually taken by one of the Untapped crew who got that tour. It's almost like a 20-minute walk from Grand Central. You've got to walk over, down, and then into the tracks. It's very hot down there. But 5 years ago, that train was removed. Now, people were saying, this is the train that had the FDR car on it. No, it was not. It was actually a baggage car or like a storage car. But if you go to Park Avenue and 50th today, you'll see this gold set of doors. And it'll say Metropolitan Transit Authority on it. And those doors do lead down to Track 61. And those elevators in Track 61, I have been told by the crew that are redoing the Waldorf Astoria right now, are actually part of the landmarked building. They cannot be altered. And they will still remain part of the structure and still have access down to Track 61 if anybody needs it. And this is where that train landed, out in a rail museum in Danbury, Connecticut. Secret number 4. This is really one of my favorites. And this is maybe a deep dive, but I sort of love this. A fake Brooklyn Heights townhouse hides a subway ventilation system. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with Brooklyn Heights, or Brooklyn Heights was really the first bedroom community in New York City. And it was spurned on by a Fulton steamboat in the 18 teens, which provided regular multiple hour a day service to Lower Manhattan. So the rich of Lower Manhattan were setting themselves up in houses on the bluffs of Brooklyn Heights right across the East River. And so many of the stately townhouses that we have left in New York today are in Brooklyn Heights, some of the oldest houses too. And this is 58 Joralemon Street. That is the address. Joralemon's right off of Atlantic Avenue, if you know the Heights well. And you can see there's a row right here of Greek Revival townhouses. And the house that I am interested in is the one dead center with the deep red painting and the black windows, because it is not a house at all. It's a subway ventilation system, but it comes from an 1847 Greek Revival brownstone, which was bought by the first subway company, the Interborough Rapid Transit Company. So here's a close-up, and I don't live all that far away from here, so I go over every once in a while, see what's doing over there. These are a couple of recent pictures that I took. Now, the idea was the first train system known as the Interborough Rapid Transit Company. Those, by the way, are, for those of you who know New York City subways, all of our number trains, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And specifically, these vent the 4 and 5 trains that go under the East River. And right when they come out in Brooklyn, or come out, they basically come from the tunnel. This vent provides fresh air down into the tunnels themselves. This is the very first subway map from 1904 from that first company. You will notice the red line from the tip of Manhattan crosses over the East River, and where that little tiny dot is the subway vent house that I am showing you. Oh, there it is, right there where the tip of my cursor is. And here was an article from the Times when the house was purchased. And it says, plant site purchase ventilator for Brooklyn Tube to be in Joralemon Street. And again, this was kind of not well accepted by the Heights. The Heights was a very tightly knit community of very affluent people who did not like where any of this was going, including the fact that the subway was going to reach their neighborhood, because that meant property values would actually fall, because back then, that's what that meant. Now, of course, it's exactly the opposite. You want to be near subway trains. You want that access. But as the Depression hit, subway access in the Heights actually meant that these gorgeous townhouses, which were single family homes, get broken up very quickly and in very many ways. Right outside of the house, right by the front door, is this. You can see NYC Transit wet standpipe for the 4-5 line. And if you peer through the very nice looking front door, this is what you see. There is no foyer, there is no house. It is a giant facility. And again, this is just my camera through the very slim crack of the door. The MTA does not want anybody in there. They don't want anybody to know it exists. And not even less than a quarter of a mile, a couple of blocks away, is the world's oldest subterranean train tunnel. Which for many, many years, London had basically taken the mantle of first rapid transit underground, which is true. The tube opens in 1870. New Yorkers were not all that pleased about missing that opportunity, but we weren't going to get our stuff together for a subway for another almost 35 years. But in the 1840s, a small train company actually built the first subterranean train tunnel under Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn Heights / Boerum Hill. And it was forgotten to time. Here's one of the few renderings or etches of it from 1844. And it was part of something called the Brooklyn and Jamaica Railroad Company. And the Brooklyn and Jamaica Railroad Company was a precursor to what we New Yorkers know as the LIRR, the Long Island Railroad, which runs today. And the Brooklyn and Jamaica would pick riders up at the foot of Atlantic Avenue. They'd take a ferry over from Lower Manhattan. And at the foot of Manhattan Avenue, they'd get on a train that would run through this tunnel for a stretch of Atlantic Avenue. And this idea was to prevent the smoke and noise and the treacherous of trains crossing a main thoroughfare in an affluent neighborhood. Because again, wealthy people didn't want the noise, the steam, and of course, in the 1840s, train technology was exploding all the time because it wasn't perfected yet. This was very early days for trains. And as you can see here, they ran the tunnel. It's not a very long stretch, but this is the most affluent stretch at the time of Atlantic Avenue. And then it would emerge and it would be elevated. It would go all the way to the North Fork of Long Island, where then you would get off the train, you'd get on another ferry, go over to Connecticut, get on another train, and then get to Boston. The whole idea was to get people from New York to Boston over Long Island. Now, what happened was they only used this tunnel for 10 years, and then they sealed it up and it got forgotten to time. It wasn't very well documented. There were very few maps or diagrams or anything with it on there. And in 1980, an engineering student who was a Brooklyn native, who actually lives in my neighborhood, not too far from me, Bob Diamond, was listening to a radio show. And somebody on the radio show said that Edwin Booth had buried his brother's diaries in a tunnel under Atlantic Avenue. Now, Edwin Booth, by the way, is John Wilkes Booth, the man who assassinated Lincoln. And Edwin was a big actor in New York, very famous and very ashamed of what his brother did. So apparently he kept trying to, clean up the family name and hide all the evidence. And Bob Diamond was like, wait a minute, there's no tunnel under Atlantic Avenue. There's no subway under there. How could there be a tunnel? And he did some digging. He became fascinated. And he found on some old gas line records that indeed there was a train company that had a tunnel that they built and only used for a couple of years. So he said, basically, I'm going to find this thing. Whatever I have to do, I'm going to dig it up. And this is a picture of him from July of 1980, discovering he's basically in between the street and the top of this long sealed train tunnel. Now, he discovers it. For many years, he's actually running tours that people could go on. I think it was a $70 ticket. I went on it in 2009. You would meet on Atlantic Avenue and Court Street, and then you'd have to wait for the light to change because your only access into the tunnel was in the middle of the street through a manhole. And this is an active street. They couldn't shut it down. As you can see, buses are going by. This car is waiting to move around the bus as one of the friends of our insiders are climbing down this manhole cover to find this tunnel. And then once you got to the bottom of the ladder, you'd reach this door, very, very dark. And once you walked beyond that door, there was a break in a brick wall. And you'd walk through that break, and it was this was, there was 100 ways you could hurt yourself down here. There was you signed so many waivers. If you died, if you broke something, none of that was Bob Diamond's fault. And then you'd walk out to here, and this picture is very deceiving because you see there are lights on. When you went down on a Bob Diamond tour, no lights. You had to bring a flashlight. They say bring your own flashlight. We will not provide light for you. But once you got down into this tunnel, anything that you saw along the sides of the tunnel was from when they shut it up in the 1850s. There were lanterns disintegrating down there, old shovels. Obviously, the track had been ripped up, but there were remnants of ties and all that sort of good stuff down there. And it was just an amazing experience to be down there. Here's another view of it. Again, very well lit, but not typical if you went on a public tour. In 2009, the fire department finally said, you can't do this anymore. This is I don't know how you've been doing this for so many years. We should have never permitted you to. And they shut him down. And he's been in litigation with the city ever since. He sued them for PTSD because he said this was his livelihood. And the tunnel has again been sealed to history. There's a picture of Bob Diamond down in the tunnel during one of the tours. And the only way that you can actually experience this, which is actually a pretty fine way to do it, if you ask me, is you could have a drink. And the coal storage room of the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel in a French restaurant called Upstairs Chez Moi, downstairs La Boudoir. La Boudoir is a cocktail bar downstairs on Atlantic Avenue. It is open, although La Boudoir, I don't know if they've opened the downstairs space yet back up to public indoor consumption. They've been doing outdoor stuff because of the pandemic. But this is a room all the way in the back. You can see the hole in the ceiling was where from street level you could dump the coal that the trains were using. And this was part of that 1840 tunnel complex. And the tunnel's right on the other side of the wall. Moving to Queens, secret number 6. The world's largest architect, I feel like a game show host. Secret number 6, the world's largest architectural model is in Queens. I do a lot of remnants of World's Fair tours because New York City played host to a World's Fair twice, once in 1939 and then again in 1964, although 1964 was not officially deemed a World's Fair. That's a longer story. But for the 1964 World's Fair, there was an architectural model of New York that was built, which became the largest and still is to this day the largest in the world. And it was housed in this building, which was known as the New York City Pavilion for the 1939 World's Fair, which today we know as the Queens Museum of Art, if you've been out there. I always tell people, it's one of, when people ask me, they're coming to New York for the first, second, you know, they haven't come to New York, what's on my top 5 list of things to do? I tell them, take the 7 train, or if you don't want to take the subway, take a taxi, go to Flushing Meadow Corona Park and go to the Panorama. It is an amazing thing. Now, this building, as you could see here, this is when it was completed as the New York City Pavilion. This is from the Grand Central Parkway in 1939, right after it was done. That circular structure, that globe-like structure was part of the theme center of the 1939 fairgrounds known as the Perisphere. It sat next to a tower called the Trilon, which you don't see pictured there. But inside, after the first World's Fair, it was an ice skating rink, as you can see here. And many Queens natives up until the early 2000s knew it as the Panorama on one half of the building and an ice skating rink on the other. What a lot of people don't also realize is that the UN sat here for 4 years in session. They covered up the ice rink with flooring, and the UN actually sat there before the UN building and complex was open on the Upper East Side in Manhattan. This building has an incredible amount of history to it. And then right after the 1964-65 World's Fair, it becomes the Queens Museum. But before that, the master builder of New York, whom you may have heard of, his name is Robert Moses, very contentious character in New York City history because of neighborhoods that he destroyed in large swaths to provide highways. Very, very divisive figure. But and by the time it was the 1964 World's Fair, he was president of that fair, and the public did not like him at this point. And he left the public a gift, which was this helicopter ride over a architectural model of New York City. And here it is today, no longer a helicopter ride. It used to be like a Disney World ride where you know, 2 people would get in this little helicopter. It would fly around the model and it would have, you know, sort of a narration that you could hear. Now they just built these catwalks where you can walk around the entire model. And it is stunning. Pictures do not do it justice. It is made up of 278 large panels that make up the 5 boroughs. It has 875,000 individual buildings on it. And it has, my favorite is it has a day and a night mode on it, which means it'll be brightly lit during the day, and then at night for about 5 minutes, everything goes dark and all of the parks glow green. You can see that the Twin Towers have been left on the model. It does get periodically updated, but it was a conscious decision to leave some buildings, even though they have been destroyed on the model. I am good friends with the Roth family of Emery, Roth and Sons, all the way back to the iconic Roth himself, Emery, who built the El Dorado and the San Remo and a lot of those big beautiful apartment structures off of Central Park. His grandson, Richard, who is still alive, he's in his late 80s, he and his son built many buildings in Lower Manhattan, which they were invited in 1990 to come onto the model and to put in the updated Emery Roth buildings on the model, which are there to this day. And he shared these personal photos with me. They're really great snapshot of when in 1990 they went from having 125,000 buildings, 825,000 buildings on the model to 875. It was a big jump. And there they are updating the model. Recently, there was, I'm sure a couple of people on this talk have seen Pretend It's a City, which is that Netflix series with Fran Lebowitz done by Martin Scorsese. Fran, in her little booties, is walking on the model, talking about the city and the model itself. And it had sort of sparked a great new interest in the Panorama. As I was bringing World's Fair tours into the Panorama, this is where we end the in-person tour, I noticed just how packed the Panorama was. Yeah, everybody's masked and everything, but usually the Panorama's got a couple people in it, and then the tour comes in and packed. And I said to one of the curators, I said, "What's going on?" And she said, "Oh, Fran Lebowitz." I was like, "Oh, okay." Great. Glad that benefits you guys. Here's another shot. Actually, these pictures were taken by Robin, who is Richard's daughter of the Roth family. My picture, some of these are mine as well, and you can see again how accurate it is down to the individual building itself. You can see Madison Square, you can see Bryant Park, you can see Herald Square. Really, really cool. And this is the view from the north looking down. And then night mode, where every one of the parks glowed green, because of course Robert Moses was the parks commissioner and he wanted you to see what he left for you. But it is a really neat model and worth a visit if you haven't been. One more picture, Central Park. Now on the ground, secret number 7, there are 2 5,000-year-old time capsules, or 5,000-year time capsules in Flushing Meadow. Again, both revolving around the World's Fairs that were on these grounds, 1939 and 1964-65. And they were the product of the Westinghouse Electric Company. And this was the Westinghouse Pavilion in 1939, very, very large, 2 large buildings. And then that tower in the center was called the Immortal Well. And in that Immortal Well, 50 feet underground, was the very first time capsule that they had created. And the big hit actually of the 1939 World's Fair for Westinghouse was actually this guy. He was Electro, the 8-foot cigar smoking robot. Everybody loved that. People cared slightly less about the time capsule and more about this guy back then. But you can see here, these, they were getting the time capsules ready. There had to be a lot of preparation. For the first World's Fair, they sunk the time capsule before the fair even opened in 1938. And they created a literal capsule. So there is a bunch of historians and journalists posit that actually the term time capsule came from the Westinghouse 1939 World's Fair. That before that, of course, we were sinking boxes, time boxes, and all these kind of things in cornerstones, but we had never called them time capsules until 1939 because of the rocket shape. And they would infuse these capsules with nitrogen and argon gas so that it would preserve all of the artifacts. And here is a picture of the Westinghouse president who's got his arm around the capsule, and the president of the World's Fair at the time, his name was Grover Whalen, sinking the capsule before the 1939 World's Fair came to be. And inside this capsule were Sears Roebuck catalogs, tobacco, pipe tobacco, chewing tobacco, a lot of tobacco, things written by Albert Einstein and scientists and philosophers of the time. And of course, it's 1939, so the world is really plunging itself into World War. And the idea behind this time capsule was, let's hope that, we make it 5,000 years as a species to reclaim this thing. And 5,000 years is a very long time, obviously. We're talking 6,939. That's a while. Here's a diagram of them sinking the time capsule under the Immortal Well in the 1939. pavilion. Now, they said to themselves, well, wait a minute, in 5,000 years, how are we going to let people know it's time to unearth this thing? What if people don't speak English anymore? What if people don't understand certain basic terminology? If you spoke to a human from 5,000 years hence, they'd think we were absolute aliens. So we had to create, or Westinghouse created a time capsule book. And this was 1,000 copies of this book were published, and inside of it were basic words spelled out phonetically, images. Actually, I have a couple. You could see here actions that humans take. I lie, I sit, I stand, I walk, I run, I kick. Things around a house. I sort of love the ye olde hearth. It's like 1939, and this is almost alien to us in 2021. And 1,000 of these books were sent out to monasteries, museums, libraries all over the world, who's tasked with keeping these safe for 5,000 years. And the way that the people of 5,000 years hence are supposed to know how to open this is by the alignment of the stars. And that is also in the book as well. When the stars are here, 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 and here, it's time for you to open this time capsule. Now, what they didn't figure on is 20 some odd years later, they were going to do another World's Fair at the same spot. So Westinghouse put a much more pared down kiosk right in the same spot where the time capsule was buried, and did a second time capsule. And so here is a display of them comparing the 1965 time capsule. And this time they didn't sink the time capsule until after the fair, as opposed to what was in the 1938 time capsule. And they built a fountain around the well, the immortal well that they called it. And the big sort of gimmick with this was you could pay a couple of bucks and get your name into the time capsule. So people 5,000 years hence will see all of these signatures. And here is a woman paying to do it. And you got a button that said, my name is in the Westinghouse time capsule for the next 5,000 years. And again, 5,000 years. That is a long time. I am happy to report that in 5,939, the humans, or whoever, maybe they're not even humans, who open this lid off and take out the time capsules do not have to wait till 5,965 to open the next time capsule. They can do both at the same time, just in case you were wondering. And that's what it looks like today. So it's actually, they drained the fountain, and it's an area where people come to sit, relax. Sometimes they do picnics or parties here. Flushing Meadow Park is a very, very active park. I actually had a guy on my last World's Fair tour a couple of weeks ago come over and say, oh, this is where I used to smoke when I was, hiding from people. Like, yeah, no, it's all good. Secret number 8, the smallest piece of land in New York City. This has also become a favorite because of Fran Lebowitz recently, but this has front and center feature on my Greenwich Village coffee tour because we walk right over it. And it marks a big developmental division in Greenwich Village. So the village, for those of you who live there or know or have been or have visited, it doesn't conform to the commissioner's grid of 1811. It's not that nice, even, very predictable north, south, east, west grid. The grid starts right above Houston Street. So the village is a crisscrossy, sort of very bucolic. I always like to say it's just a great place to get lost, and it's very easy to still get lost down there. And it was even more sort of labyrinthine before 1916. Now in 1916, Pennsylvania Station opens in the 30s, and the Interborough Rapid Transit, that subway company, decides they want to run subway service south from Penn Station all the way down to Lower Manhattan so that Penn Station is, accessible. To do that, they wanted to extend 7th Avenue from the grid down through Greenwich Village. That actually required them destroying a couple of hundred structures. You can see this old map overlaid over 7th Avenue. All of the buildings that were in the way get destroyed. Now, we're interested in this building right here. You see it says Voorhees right on the corner of Grove Street and what will become 7th Avenue South. So what happens is they create 7th Avenue, they claim eminent domain on buildings that were not sold, they destroy them, extend the avenue, and build the subway tunnel right under it. It's the Christopher Street stop on the one. And you cannot even see it, but at the very, 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 very tip of lot 55, there's actually a lot 56, and it's so small they couldn't fit the number in it. Now this, the Voorhees, the building that was destroyed, was actually the property of a guy named David Hess. And he was a Philadelphian who bought the building as an investment. He didn't live there. He didn't have a huge attachment to it, but he was really ticked off that the city took his land and plowed it over. But then what he didn't realize was that the city left a percentage of an acre of a plot of his land on the corner of the street, which he was actually billed for in taxes. Even after his death, his son Frank gets a bill for $100 from the city for taxes. And he goes, why? You took that land from my father. Nuh-uh, there was a little piece left. But here are some buildings from the featured in the New York Times that were taken out because of the 7th Avenue extension. This is actually a picture. They did the same thing with 6th Avenue, and I couldn't find any construction photos of 7th, but this is a really good way to visualize what they were doing. They were sort of destroying the buildings, building the subway stations under, and then recreating streets over it, much like they did behind Grand Central for that Terminal City, that Park Avenue decking that I showed you. And it really upended the village. And many people were displaced because of this. And it's something, we don't talk about. We sort of always just kind of think, oh yeah, 6th Avenue didn't always run through. 7th Avenue didn't always run through the West Village. Now, this is great because what happens is Frank Hess, the son of David, does not want this piece of land. The Hess family has actually sold plot 55 to the owners then of what is still today a cigar shop. And he basically tacks on this little piece of land, but says, I want to put a plaque there that says that this is private property and it's never intended for public use. And what's funny is the man who they sold the property to, his name was Brian Hughes, and he was a huge jokester. And he actually called all of the press out for an opening of a park that he was going to put on this little piece of land. And of course, everybody knew it was a joke, except the Hartford Courant from Connecticut, who actually came down to cover this thing and found that he had the wool pulled over his eyes. And this is actually a quote from the article. I love it. Quote, "No attempt has been made, so far as I can discover, to carry out Mr. Hughes's injunctions that it be set out with trees, shrubs, flower beds, a bandstand, and benches. In Manhattan, it would hardly serve as breathing space for a subway sardine." Now, to put it into perspective, and of course, I'm going to show you a picture of it again, it is 0.0000797,113 of an acre. It's smaller than an American yield sign on the street. And there it is. It's this little plaque right outside of the cigar shop. Still there today. I took this picture 2 Decembers ago when we were launching our coffee tour. And there it says on it, property of the Hess estate, which has never been dedicated for public purposes. And of course, it is private property now of the lot behind it as well. But that was the little piece of land that they had forgot to shave off the map. Secret number 9, we're rounding out towards the end. Well, we have a couple more. The original Dutch New Amsterdam street grid is hiding in plain sight. Now, this was the second tour I ever developed for Untapped New York. And the thing that I still love about this tour, because we're running it 7 years later, is just how surprised New Yorkers are by this fact and how many Dutch natives come from the Netherlands because, everybody loves New York, right? And they love the fact that there is such a deep connection to Dutch history and roots still on the streets of New York today. And it's literally the streets of New York. There aren't any buildings left. This map that you are looking at is called the Castello Plan map. And actually, this is a version of the Castello Plan, which was made quite beautiful in the 19th century. But this depicts New Amsterdam in 1660. Very quickly, for those of you who may not know, but I'm sure most of you on this talk do know, New York was settled by a Dutch company, the Dutch West India Company, for the fur trade, mainly beaver fur. That's why beaver are on our city symbol. And it was a company-run town until the British take it over in 1664, and it becomes a crown colony and also changed to New York. But very much like Amsterdam itself, New Amsterdam had canals. They didn't work very well. Dutch steeple-roofed buildings, and of course, a very, very great Dutch mentality of business and tolerance that still is part of the DNA of New York today. Now, this is a satellite image of Lower Manhattan. Just to give you an idea, I know it's probably hard to see, but my cursor is tracing over that Castello Plan map, that original Dutch street grid, which is still alive and well today in Lower Manhattan. So much so that in 1983, New York landmarks actually landmarked the street grid, not per se the buildings on the streets, but the streets themselves, meaning that you could not break or alter this Dutch street grid at all because it is protected by Landmarks Commission, because again, it is our largest remnant of our Dutch past. Here is a computer rendering of the original Castello Plan Dutch New Amsterdam map over a current Lower Manhattan satellite map, just to show you just how much land we created over about the space of 300 or so years. Quite a bit. So this is the map that I give out on the tour. And then, we walk around picking out and tracing historical elements that are still alive, but you'll see where the star is. It's by Q and uppercase P, lowercase L, which is a William Street today, called Schmeestraat back then. If there are any Dutch people, I apologize. My pronunciations never got any better over 7 years. I try, but Schmee actually meant smith, like a smithy. And you can see it's sort of almost like a five-corner situation. And the reason why I love this spot is when I bring the tour there, this is what it looks like today. And you can see how the buildings in Lower Manhattan built themselves to conform to the Dutch street grid. And it's a really very visceral, neat thing. And things that, again, most New Yorkers just walk right by. They don't notice it. They don't think about it. But I like to stop and say, this is a Dutch colonial path that these massive masonry structures built themselves into. And that's what it looks like from the sky. One of the things, I took a group of British students, architectural students from Leeds on a tour. They got right off the plane and took this tour early in the morning. The poor things were just barely awake. And I said, all right, talking about that street grid in the corner, and the professor, I'll never forget it, she said, all right, students, how do we get a good view of, street level when we're standing on street level? And they all took their cell phones out. They all pointed them up at the sky and took a picture of the streets sort of outlined in the sky between the buildings. And like little tingles went down my neck. And I said, I'm going to tell that story on every version of this tour I do. And I do. I love it. And of course, there is a plaque which was donated by the Dutch government. It was a gift to New York City to commemorate 400 years in 2009 of Henry Hudson pulling into this area and finding the island of Manhattan for the Dutch West India Company. Of course, it had been there for millions of years. Related secret number 10, Bowling Green's fence is a standing record to the American Revolution and one of the oldest standing structures in Lower Manhattan. So Bowling Green was actually part of New Amsterdam. It was not officially a park, but it was a place where New Amsterdammers would, at the end of a day, be able to get a cold one at a tavern right at number 3 Broadway. And they'd set up bowling pins and they would bowl on the green of the base of the Heerstraat, otherwise known as Broadway. The British, when they take over, the Dutch stay. Nobody leaves. They all sort of coexist fairly well. There's a skirmish a couple of years later, but it's all right. It works itself out. Um, they, the British see this and they call it Bowling Green for that purpose. Flash forward to the 1760s. King George III imposes the Townshend Acts on his rowdy settlers over in North America. They don't like it very much. They start rioting a bit. New Yorkers played it cool. So King George III, as a gift to the well-intended New York colonists, gives them a gilded gold statue, mainly lead, of him as Marcus Aurelius, which they place right in the center of the fountain where that water is spitting up. And the New Yorkers hated it. It was like, oh, really? You shouldn't have. So at night, it gets vandalized. A year later, they erect the fence that is still there now. Now, for those of you who live in Europe or other parts of the world where your urban history runs much deeper, where you could walk out of your apartments and see Roman ruins, this is a big deal to New Yorkers because this thing is from 1766. Ooh, and that's old. That's especially old for Lower Manhattan. Now, as the story further goes, and there's Bowling Green before it's a park, it becomes a municipal park in 1733. On the evening of July 9th, 1776, George Washington calls all of his militiamen up to what is City Hall Park today, known as New York Common then. They read a copy of the Declaration of Independence, which was sent up from Philadelphia, and they get so charged with patriotism. What's the first thing people do? Well, they get some crowbars, they get some rope, and they go down to Bowling Green, and they take down that statue of George III. They behead it. They shoot the forehead with a musket bullet. They chop him up into pieces and send him off to Litchfield, Connecticut, to be melted down into roughly 48,000 musket bullets, which they will use against the Redcoats when they come. That building in this painting right on the left side is number 1 Broadway. That was the headquarters for Washington. He was not a part of these festivities. He would not take part. But as you can see, a lot of New Yorkers, as this painting tells us, joined in. There were also crown finials on top of every one of the posts of that fence, which were also sawed off and melted down and used for bullets. And you can still, to this day, as you can see here, run your fingers over the uneven cuts that those New York patriots made that night as they sawed those crowns off. Now, I'm very tactile, especially on tours. I invite people to touch history, especially when it's not cordoned off or there's no ropes or there's no glass. You gotta experience history that way. So on every tour, I always invite everybody to basically run their fingers over the posts there. And this is one of our early Dutch New Amsterdam tours. Augustin, my coworker, was on taking photos that day. Oh no, it was Michelle. There, it's right there. And it's one of my favorite things. I did it with a group of students last week. A group of students whose school is right across the street from here, by the way. Secret number 11, next to last. There is a century-old clock built into a Broadway sidewalk. Also, this topic made popular by Friendly Buits on Pretend It's a City. If you've enjoyed this talk and haven't seen it, I would suggest you watch Pretend It's a City. But we have a unique connection to it too, which I sort of just love. So in Broadway, right by Broadway and Maiden Lane, a German immigrant by the name of Frederick William Barthman in 1884 starts a jewelry store. He comes over from Germany. He's a trained jeweler. He's certified in Germany as a jeweler. And in a very, very simple brick building on the corner of Broadway and Maiden Lane, he opens a jewelry shop. And he decides, sort of as a gimmick, he wants to attract people into the shop. Now, they put a clock in the sidewalk. Now, you'll see here the clock that is portrayed, this is not a photograph, obviously, it's a sketch, was very, very complicated. It was actually built by another German immigrant named Frank Holm. And he created, I don't know if anybody remembers, really, when I was a kid, there were those alarm clocks that had the little panels that would peel back every minute, every hour, every second to change. I remember my dad had an alarm clock until I was like 15, and it was from the 70s. That's what the original Barthman clock looked like. And it really attracted people. They had never seen a clock like this before. No hands, no round face. And it said Barthman right in the middle of it. The problem was it was installed in 1898. It was way ahead of its time. And Frank Holm dies in 1917, and nobody knows how to maintain this thing. Meanwhile, Barthman has become so rich that he knocks down his very, very plain brick building, and he builds the building that's there today, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous building on the corner, which I'll show you a larger picture of. But when Frank Holm dies, they have to replace the very modern clock with a very traditional clock out in front of the entrance of the store. And that is the timepiece, although it's moved from this location to the corner, it is the same timepiece that works today. This is a picture of the Barthman clock in the 1940s. Again, in a different, same spot, but the sidewalk was different. That's, poured concrete and glass block to sort of light up the whole area at night. And this was a photo of the Barthman clock that we at Untapped took a couple of years ago. And the Barthman clock was taken out for a couple of years. About 2 years ago, it was taken out to be repaired, and there was nothing but a black hole there, as you can see here from this picture I took 2 years ago, and it was gone for months and months, over a year. And all it was the glass and no clock structure. The day they installed it, I was giving a tour, and this was a stop on the tour, and I saw them getting ready to put it back in. They had lifted the whole canister out. They were putting the timepiece. I went nuts. I was like, oh my God, are you kidding me? It's coming back. One of our news outlets, New York One, was there, and the reporter comes running up to me. I had a group of like 25 people on a private tour, and he said, do you know something about this clock? And I said, oh, do I? I do a whole interview, drop the tour off, come back, clock's gone again. It couldn't fit. They had the wrong casing for it, and it disappeared for another 2 months before they put it back in. Now, Barthman disappeared from this location. The Barthman location is now on Broad Street, but during the pandemic, this was a vitamin shop, and the vitamin shop closed up, and they took the vitamin shop, the gaudy vitamin shop signage out, and you can see the ghost of the old, you could see it right there, Barthman, the Barthman signage from the original store from 1898. And here is the side around the corner. You can see Barthman over the entrance to the building as well. And this space was abandoned for a couple of months, but then like a trinket shop, a New York memorabilia and trinket shop, has made it a temporary outpost. It still is today. The problem is, this is what the clock looks like. This is what, this was my picture from August. It's dirty. There's a lot of grime. And the producers of Pretend It's a City reached out to us at Untapped New York and said, can we license your Barthman clock photo from you? We said, sure. We thought that they were going to do like, a voiceover and then, pan over the photo like a Ken Burns documentary. But what happened was, I get such a kick out of this, they actually CGI'd our picture of the clock onto the clock. That's Fran's shoe. That's Fran standing right over. And they CGI'd it right in there. Totally crazy. And you could see that. And our last secret today, the first and most beautiful subway station has been abandoned since 1945. And for those of you who know New York City Transit, for those of you who know New York, this may not be as much of a secret to you, but this is, I call it sort of the stairway to heaven of New York City secrets. It's the one that always gets played. City Hall Station was part of the very first, again, I'd mentioned the Interborough Rapid Transit Subway Company, which opened in 1904. This is a subway track outline blueprint. City Hall is here. It's this very small station built onto the turn of a turnaround loop, where today the 6 train goes from a downtown train, turns around in this tunnel, and becomes an uptown train. It was shut down in 1945 because, well, a couple of reasons. Let me not get ahead of myself here. Because of the unique shape of the station, which you see built on that curve, literally at the apex of a curve, it was required that they did a sort of a vaulted ceiling job for the subway, not just a plain rectangular platform They needed to actually build it almost like a tube, a bending tube. And the only engineer who could do something like that and do it beautifully were the Guastavinos, Raphael Guastavino, the second and the third, father and son. And this is actually a photo of Raphael Guastavino III looking on as they are building what will become the 14 support arches that hold the vaults of this structure up and give it a very unique look. Very rare photo, by the way. The Guastavinos did not like to be photographed because they considered their vaulted ceiling technology to be proprietary because it was fireproof. And here is a postcard from 1905 of one of our early subway trains in City Hall Station. You can see those gorgeous vaulted cathedral-like ceilings, decorative tile, beige, green, off-white. Those, you can see a sort of hint of it right here. Those are skylights that are bringing through leaded glass light from above. Here's another postcard from early days of this subway station right here. Beautiful, subtle chandeliers. Now, for those of you who've never been on a New York City subway or haven't been in a while, we don't have these things in the subway. It's not part of the vernacular of our subway architecture. We have a bunch of new stations, which look very different, but nothing as sort of artful as this, which makes it a really big draw for people who are trying to find the station. It's been featured in movies. It's been recreated multiple times in movies. This is a picture of the mezzanine with the old wooden ticket counter that was there until 1945. And we, a fan of Untapped New York, sent us from his own personal collection one of the signs noting the closure of the station. It was going to be New Year's Eve, 1945. It was going to close down, and they were no longer going to be using this local station, mainly because the trains had extended. So there were, instead of having 5 trains now, there were 12 trains in a set. So half of the trains weren't platforming in City Hall. The turn made it very hard to get on and off the trains. There were dangerous gaps. And it was only one platform. It only went uptown, and people weren't using it. As you could see, it says Brooklyn Bridge City Hall, express and local station 600 feet away. That's where everybody was going, because you could get to Brooklyn from there. You could go uptown. You can go everywhere. City Hall kind of became this dinosaur nobody used. And here is a modern picture of it that I took a couple of years ago. Really, really gorgeous, although in need of a little bit of love right now. There's a lot of water damage going on in there. And here's the opposite view from the other end. And the mezzanine level now without the ticket booth. This is, oh, I forgot I put this in here. This is actually, so on our subway tour, one of the things we do is we stay on the 6th train, we ride through, which is the way that you can see City Hall without the Transit Museum, which is very hard to do. And I thought I would include, this was from one of our tour goers sent me this. It goes by very quickly, but I guess it's fun. That's how quick it goes by. It's a very tiny station. And of course, that was my voice in the background telling everybody to look up the chandelier. And I'll end on the note that one of the things that I most enjoyed so far about my career, although there's so many things, was I had partnered with the Transit Museum and our Untapped New York artist in residence, Aaron Assis, to do a installation at the Transit Museum about City Hall Station, because there are 14 support arches and 14 lines in a sonnet. I decided to write a sonnet. I'm not the best poet in the world. I'm a writer, but you know, I thought, why not? I'll give it a try. And much like a Shakespearean sonnet, there's a little bit of change in format, which I'll tell you about in 2 seconds. But what highlight, I'm such a nerd, we actually got the Metropolitan Transit Authority, the MTA, to print the sonnet in official MTA signage so that we could put it up the staircase at the Court Street Museum subway station. where it lived for quite a long time. I don't think it's there anymore, and the museum is not open at the moment because of the pandemic. But it was 14 lines, and the reason why I did it was a man had reached out to me before one of our tours a couple of years ago and said, I want to propose to my wife on your subway tour, or my fiance, or hopeful fiance, right when we hit City Hall. And I was like, ooh, I was like, the timing's going to be really tough. But we worked with him. We tried to get it right. He was a little nervous, and it never happened. But the sonnet sort of became the outgrowth of that. I'll end by reading. It's very quick. It's a sonnet. But because to take the 6 from the terminal downtown, which then it loops around and becomes an uptown 6, I reused the A rhyme scheme as the last part of the couplet because it's sort of a mirror of what happens. And it goes like this. This is the last stop on the downtown 6. It will be going back the way it came. The riders leave, but we know all the tricks since we're the only ones who still remain. No one could know the treasures that we hid down deep inside this long abandoned jewel, those 14 arches flown against a grid, each one a bending arc of love's strange rules. My heart's a station buried on a turn, and your heart's a station stretching in the dark, a union sealed when naked lights do burn for all to see this universe we mark. Our twin souls at their edges ever mix. This is the first stop on the Uptown 6. And I said to the guy, listen, good luck. Here's the sonnet.